My husband secretly put our house in his mother's name. I found out before the closing papers were signed. Have you ever looked at the person you trusted most in the world and realized in one single moment that they had been quietly planning a future without you? Not because they stopped loving you, or at least that's what they claimed, but because they believed they could make one life, changing decision behind your back, and you'd never find out. I never imagined that a simple email, arriving on an ordinary Wednesday evening, would completely change the way I looked at my husband, my marriage, and the dream we'd spent years building together. If I hadn't opened that document before signing day, I would have handed over nearly everything I'd worked for without even realizing it. So before we get into today's story, if you've ever been told to just trust me when it came to money, property, or family, you might want to stay until the end, because sometimes the smallest line in a legal document can reveal the biggest betrayal. My name is Ayla, and until all of this happened, I believed I had a marriage that most people would envy. James and I had been married for 5 years. We met in Chicago through mutual friends, and from the beginning, our relationship felt easy. We weren't one of those couples who fought over every little thing. We laughed together, supported each other's careers, and spent countless evenings dreaming about the future. Neither of us came from wealthy families, so every milestone we reached felt earned. We celebrated promotions with homemade dinners instead of expensive restaurants, and when friends splurged on luxury vacations, we'd smile politely, wish them a great trip, and stay home because every extra dollar had a purpose. That purpose was simple. We wanted a home, not just any house, but a place where we could eventually raise a family, host Thanksgiving dinners, decorate for Christmas, and build traditions that would last for decades. We talked about that dream so often that it almost felt real long before we ever started looking at listings. The only problem was that Chicago wasn't exactly cheap. Every time we thought we were getting closer, mortgage rates shifted, prices climbed, or another expense popped up. More than once we wondered if we should just keep renting for a few more years, but every conversation ended the same way. "We're too close to quit now," James would say, and I'd nod because I believed him. For 3 straight years, our lives revolved around one goal. We became experts at saying no. No weekend getaways. No new cars. No fancy furniture. No impulsive online shopping. I learned dozens of budget recipes because eating out became a luxury instead of a habit. James packed lunch for work almost every day. I started bringing coffee from home instead of buying one every morning. We canceled streaming services we barely watched, skipped concerts our friends invited us to, and watched our savings account grow one careful deposit at a time. Sometimes it felt exhausting. There were evenings when I'd scroll through social media and see people my age relaxing on beaches in Hawaii or posting pictures from European vacations. And for just a second I'd wonder if we were sacrificing too much. Then James would pull up our savings account on his laptop. "We're getting there," he'd tell me with a grin. Every time I saw that number climb higher, the sacrifices felt worth it, because this wasn't just his dream. It wasn't just mine. It was ours. Or at least that's what I believed. Money was never something we argued about. We both contributed to our joint savings account every month. We had separate checking accounts for everyday expenses, but the down payment fund belonged to both of us. Every paycheck, we transferred money into that account without fail. Watching it grow became almost like a shared hobby. Whenever someone asked how we managed to save so much, James would laugh and say, "Discipline." I would usually add, "and a lot of frozen dinners." People assumed we were naturally good with money. The truth was much less glamorous. Saving meant constantly choosing tomorrow over today. It meant walking away from things we wanted because we wanted something bigger even more. Eventually, after years of patience, we finally reached our target. I still remember the Saturday morning when our realtor called. She sounded so excited that I immediately thought something had gone wrong. Instead, she said the words I'd been dreaming about for years. Our offer was accepted. I screamed so loudly that James came running into the kitchen thinking someone had gotten hurt. When I told him, he wrapped me in the biggest hug I'd ever received. "We did it," he whispered. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not the bills, not the stress, not the years we'd spent sacrificing, just the feeling that we'd finally crossed the finish line. That weekend, we drove to the property again. Even though we'd already toured it twice, the house wasn't a mansion. It wasn't flashy, but to me, it looked perfect. A beautiful colonial-style home tucked into a quiet suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets, wide sidewalks, and children riding bicycles in nearby driveways. The front porch had white columns that reminded me of homes I'd admired in magazines. The backyard was large enough for summer barbecues, and there was even room for the vegetable garden I'd always talked about planting someday. Standing in the driveway, I could already picture our future. I imagined carrying groceries through the front door, decorating the living room for Christmas, painting a nursery one day, growing old there. James squeezed my hand. "This is home." I smiled without hesitation. It already feels like it. The following weeks were a blur of inspections, paperwork, emails, phone calls, and endless signatures. Buying a house, I quickly learned, involved enough documents to fill an entire filing cabinet. Every day there seemed to be another form needing initials, another disclosure requiring signatures, another financial statement to upload. I joked that buying the house felt like applying for the world's longest job interview. James laughed. "I'll handle most of the boring stuff." "You sure?" "Absolutely. You focus on the fun part." The fun part. The decorating. Paint colors. Furniture. Making it ours. I didn't argue. Honestly, I was relieved. My job had become increasingly demanding, and James seemed genuinely interested in handling the mortgage broker, the title company, the lender, and all the legal paperwork. He said he actually enjoyed reading contracts, which sounded unbelievable to me. So I trusted him. Whenever an email came in about financing, he'd glance over it and tell me everything looked fine. Whenever I asked if there was anything I needed to review, he'd smile and say, "Nothing exciting, just standard paperwork." That answer became so routine that eventually I stopped asking. Instead, I threw myself into imagining our new life. I spent evenings comparing paint samples online. I measured furniture we'd owned for years to make sure it would fit in the new living room. I created inspiration boards filled with warm lighting, cozy rugs, and farmhouse-style kitchens. Sometimes I'd send James photos asking which dining table he preferred. His response was almost always the same: "Whatever makes you happy." Looking back now, that sentence feels different. At the time, it sounded loving. Now I wonder if it was simply an easy way to keep my attention focused everywhere except the paperwork that mattered most. The closing date was finally scheduled for a Friday afternoon. We were only 2 days away from officially becoming homeowners. I remember thinking the hardest part was behind us. I had absolutely no idea that the real story, the one that would test everything I believed about trust, marriage, and loyalty, was about to begin with a single notification lighting up my phone on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday evening. Wednesday evening started like any other. James had texted me earlier that afternoon to let me know he was meeting a client for dinner and probably be home until late. I told him to have a good evening, heated up some leftover pasta, changed into my favorite oversized sweatshirt, and settled onto the couch with my laptop. The house we'd been renting suddenly felt temporary. Everywhere I looked, I caught myself thinking, this is one of the last times we'll be doing this here. In less than 48 hours, we'd have our own place, our own front door, our own mailbox, our own little corner of the world. I was already making mental lists. Which room should we paint first? Would our old sectional fit in the family room, or should we save for a new one? Should we finally get the king size bed we'd always talked about? The possibilities felt endless, and for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what we had to sacrifice. I was thinking about everything we'd finally earned. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. At first, I barely glanced at it. I assumed it was James sending another message about his dinner, or maybe my sister sharing another funny video. Instead, I saw an automated email notification, final closing disclosure and draft deed for buyer review. My heart skipped with excitement. This was it, the documents that would officially make us homeowners. I smiled without even realizing it and immediately opened the email. The escrow officer had included a short note thanking us for our cooperation throughout the transaction. Attached were several PDF files that both buyers were encouraged to review before the closing appointment to ensure all information was accurate. I remember thinking how responsible they were for encouraging people to double check everything. I almost didn't bother. After all, James had been handling the paperwork from the beginning. He'd probably already reviewed every page. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the first document. Page after page showed numbers we'd already discussed: purchase price, loan amount, interest rate, closing costs, taxes. Everything looked exactly as expected. I scrolled through slowly anyway, partly because I was excited and partly because seeing everything in writing made the purchase finally feel real. Then I reached the draft deed. My smile grew even wider. I don't know why, but seeing our names printed there felt more meaningful than any mortgage approval or inspection report. This was the page I'd been waiting for. I zoomed in. Buyer. My eyes immediately found James's name. James Kane. I smiled. Then I looked for mine. Instead, I froze. For a second, I honestly thought I had misread it. I blinked several times. Then I leaned closer to the screen. Maybe the font was small. Maybe my eyes were tired. I read the line again. James Kane and Martha Kane as joint tenants. I stared at the screen without breathing. No, that couldn't be right. There had to be another page. Maybe this was a draft from another transaction. Maybe the title company had accidentally attached the wrong file. I flipped through every page again. Nothing changed. The buyers listed on the deed were still James and Martha Kane, my mother-in-law, not me. I actually laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. This has to be a mistake. I whispered to the empty apartment. I refreshed the document, closed it, opened it again, downloaded it to my laptop. Opened the downloaded copy, exactly the same. My pulse started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I grabbed my phone and searched through previous emails from our realtor. Every offer we'd submitted, every document we'd signed, every financial statement, everything clearly showed that James and I were buying the property together. So why wasn't I on the deed? I picked up my phone to call James. My thumb hovered over his contact. One tap. That's all it would take. He'd answer. He'd probably tell me it was some clerical error. The title company would apologize. We'd laugh about how stressed buying a house had made both of us. I wanted that explanation more than anything, but something stopped me. A strange feeling settled into my stomach, not fear exactly, instinct, because if this were really an innocent mistake, why hadn't James mentioned it? He'd handled every conversation with the mortgage broker, every email with the title company, every discussion about the legal paperwork. He'd repeatedly told me not to worry about the documents because he had everything under control. Suddenly, those reassuring words sounded very different inside my head. I opened the email one more time. This time I noticed something I had completely overlooked. The escrow officer hadn't addressed it only to me. The email had been sent to both buyers, James and me, which meant James had received these exact same documents at exactly the same time. If he had already reviewed them, then he already knew. I looked at the clock. 7:18 p.m. and hadn't called. He hadn't texted. He hadn't warned me. Nothing. My stomach twisted. I stood up and began pacing the living room. No. There has to be another explanation. I kept repeating those words as though saying them enough times would magically make them true. Then another memory surfaced. About 2 months earlier, we'd been having dinner at James's mother's house. The conversation had somehow drifted toward real estate. Martha had smiled and said, "These days, you young couples never know what will happen. Assets should always stay protected within the family." At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. James had simply nodded. I assumed they were talking in general. Now, that conversation came rushing back with terrifying clarity. Another memory followed. When we'd first started looking at homes, Martha had jokingly said, "Just don't let my son lose everything if you two ever split up." Everyone had laughed, including me. I remembered answering, "We aren't planning on splitting up." She'd smiled. "I know, dear. Nobody ever plans to." Back then, it had sounded like harmless advice from an older woman who'd seen a few divorces. Now, it sounded completely different. I suddenly wondered how many conversations had happened when I wasn't in the room, how many phone calls James had taken privately, how many decisions had already been made without me ever knowing. The apartment felt strangely quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. Cars passed outside. Somewhere upstairs, a neighbor was vacuuming. Life was continuing as normal while my entire world tilted beneath my feet. I walked over to our desk where we'd kept a folder labeled House. Inside were bank statements showing every transfer I'd made into our savings account over the last 3 years. Thousands of dollars, birthday bonuses, tax refunds, work bonuses, overtime pay. Every extra penny had gone toward one shared dream. I ran my fingers across the pages. Half of that down payment was mine, not gifted, not borrowed, earned. I had worked nights, skipped vacations, passed on things I'd wanted. I had sacrificed just as much as James had. Yet somehow, according to the document sitting on my laptop, I wasn't about to become a homeowner at all. I was about to become the person helping finance a house that legally belonged to my husband and his mother. The realization hit me so hard I had to sit down. If I hadn't opened that email, if I'd simply shown up on Friday and signed wherever someone pointed, would anyone have stopped me? Would anyone have said, "Ayla, did you notice your name isn't on the deed?" Or would they have watched me unknowingly wire my life savings into a property where I had no legal ownership? The answer terrified me. For the first time that evening, I wasn't just shocked. I was angry. Not the kind of anger that makes you scream. The dangerous kind. The quiet kind that sharpens your thoughts instead of clouding them. I closed my eyes and took one slow breath. James still thought I knew nothing, and for the moment I intended to keep it that way. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same line from the deed, James Kane and Martha Kane, as joint tenants. It was burned into my memory. At some point around 3 in the morning, I stopped trying to force myself to sleep. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat in the darkness, staring out the window. Chicago was unusually quiet at that hour. A few cars rolled through the intersection below, their headlights briefly lighting the apartment before disappearing again. I kept asking myself the same question. Was this really James? The man I'd trusted for 5 years? The man who always insisted we were a team? I replayed every conversation we'd ever had about the house, every promise, every plan, every... Had those words actually meant me, or had they only meant him all along? Around 6:30 that morning, I heard the apartment door unlock. James stepped inside, looking tired from his business dinner. He smiled the moment he saw me sitting at the kitchen table. "You're up early." I couldn't sleep. He walked over, kissed the top of my head, and started making coffee as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Everything okay?" I looked at him carefully. He sounded completely normal, relaxed, comfortable. Either he had no idea what was happening, or he was an incredibly convincing liar. "I've just been thinking about tomorrow," I answered. He smiled without looking up. "Me too. Can you believe we're finally doing this?" I wanted to ask him right then, "Who's Martha? Why isn't my name on the deed? Why did you think I'd never notice?" The questions sat on the tip of my tongue, but I swallowed every one of them. Instead, I forced a smile. "I still can't believe it." He handed me a mug of coffee. "One more day. One more day." Those 3 words echoed in my mind. Yes, one more day. One more day for me to figure out exactly what he was trying to do. James showered, changed into his work clothes, and left for the office with his usual cheerful goodbye. "Love you? I love you too." The words came out automatically. The moment the front door closed, my expression disappeared. I wasn't going to spend another hour guessing. At exactly 8 o'clock, when the title company opened, I made my first phone call. The receptionist transferred me to our escrow officer, a calm, professional woman named Denise. "Good morning, Ayla. Is everything all right?" "I hope so," I said carefully. "I reviewed the draft deed you emailed last night, and I noticed something that doesn't make sense." There was a brief pause. "What seems to be the issue?" "My name isn't listed as one of the buyers." Silence. I heard papers shuffling, then keyboard clicks. "One moment while I pull up your file." My heartbeat quickened. After nearly a minute, Denise spoke again, her voice noticeably more cautious. "I see what you're referring to. Can you explain why my mother-in-law is listed instead of me?" Another pause. "I'm not really authorized to discuss internal instructions without all parties present." That answer told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a random typo. This had been instructed. I took a slow breath. "I'm one of the people providing the down payment." "Yes." "And I'm one of the borrowers on the mortgage." "Yes." "So why am I not one of the owners?" Denise hesitated. "I think this conversation would be best handled with your attorney present." Attorney. Until that moment, I'd almost forgotten we'd hired one during the transaction to review closing documents. I thanked Denise, ended the call, and immediately dialed his office. Thankfully, he answered personally. "This is David. Mr. Lawson, it's Ayla Kane." "Good morning, Ayla. Everything ready for tomorrow?" "Actually, no." I briefly explained what I'd found. His tone changed instantly. "I'm looking at your file now." "Hold on." Several moments passed. Then he spoke very slowly. "Ayla, did you authorize this ownership structure?" "No." "Did you sign any waiver relinquishing ownership rights?" "No." "Did anyone explain why another individual would be placed on title instead of you?" "No." His voice became firm. "Then don't sign anything." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." For the first time since discovering the deed, I felt like someone else recognized how serious this was. "This isn't a minor issue," he continued. "Ownership determines legal rights. If your funds are contributing to the purchase, But your name isn't on title. You could be exposing yourself to significant financial risk. I closed my eyes. Hearing someone else say it made everything feel terrifyingly real. So what do I do? I'd like to arrange a meeting before tomorrow's closing. Without James knowing? Another short pause. That would actually be preferable. Exactly what I'd been thinking. I also recommend we review every document in the transaction, not just the deed. My stomach tightened again. Every document. How much else had I never seen? Within 30 minutes, David had coordinated with Denise at the title company. Instead of our scheduled Friday afternoon signing, they quietly arranged a document review for Thursday afternoon, 2 hours before James believed anyone would be meeting. He would walk into what he expected to be a routine closing preparation. Instead, he'd walk into a room where everyone already knew what had happened. Before hanging up, David gave me one final piece of advice. Whatever you do, I won't. If this was intentional, you'll learn much more by letting him believe everything is proceeding normally. That made perfect sense. The truth usually reveals itself when people don't know they're being watched. The rest of the morning felt surreal. James texted me around lunchtime. "How's your day going?" I stared at the message. How was my day? I had just discovered that my husband might have been trying to cut me out of ownership of the biggest investment we'd ever made together. But he was asking about my day as if everything were perfectly normal. I typed back, "Busy, looking at furniture online." His reply came almost immediately. "Can't wait to see what you pick. Love you, love you." I read those words 3 times, then locked my phone without answering. That afternoon, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I pulled up every financial record connected to our house purchase. Bank transfers, wire confirmations, savings statements, pay stubs. I highlighted every contribution I'd personally made over the previous 3 years. The total was staggering. I knew I contributed a lot. I hadn't realized exactly how much. By the time I finished organizing everything into a folder, one thing had become crystal clear. No one, not James, not his mother, not anyone, would ever be able to argue that this house had been purchased with his money alone. It simply wasn't true. Around 5 that evening, James came home carrying takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. Normally, I would have been thrilled. Instead, I found myself wondering whether the dinner was genuine affection or guilt. He set the food on the kitchen counter. I figured neither of us would feel like cooking. "Good idea." He smiled. "We're celebrating tomorrow." Tomorrow. He kept talking about tomorrow. He had no idea tomorrow wasn't going to unfold the way he'd planned. During dinner, he chatted about work. A difficult client, an upcoming project, traffic on the expressway, everything except the house paperwork. Not once did he mention the deed. Not once did he say, "By the way, there's something we should discuss." He laughed. He made jokes. He even reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I smiled when appropriate, answered when necessary, and silently wondered whether I was sitting across from the man I married or someone I had never truly known. Later that night, after James had gone to bed, I quietly packed my folder of financial records, printed copies of the draft deed, and placed everything inside my work bag. Tomorrow wasn't just another appointment. It wasn't just another signing. It was the moment I would finally learn whether this had all been a terrible misunderstanding or the biggest betrayal of my life. Either way, by this time tomorrow, nothing about my marriage would ever be the same again. Thursday morning felt strangely calm, not because I was at peace, because my mind had moved past shock and settled into something much colder, determination. The tears I'd expected never came. I wasn't interested in crying anymore. I wanted answers. James left for work a little after 8, giving me another quick kiss before walking out the door. "I'll see you tonight." I smiled. "See you tonight." As soon as the elevator doors closed behind him, I picked up my bag and headed for my own car. The title company had asked me to arrive at 1 o'clock. James still believed our official signing review wasn't until 3. 2 hours. That was the only advantage I had. As I drove across Chicago, I kept rehearsing different possibilities in my head. Maybe there really had been a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had copied the wrong deed template. Maybe James had trusted someone else's advice without understanding the consequences. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But another part of me couldn't ignore one simple fact. Replacing someone's name on a legal deed isn't the kind of mistake people make by accident. Someone has to approve it. Someone has to provide that information. When I arrived at the title company's office, Denise was already waiting in the lobby. She greeted me with a polite smile, though I could tell from her expression that she understood the seriousness of the situation. "Good afternoon, Ayla. Thank you for meeting with me." Of course, she led me into a conference room where our attorney, David Lawson, was already seated with a thick stack of documents spread neatly across the table. He stood and shook my hand. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." The room was quiet, professional, nothing dramatic, just a polished wooden table, several leather chairs, bottled water, and enough paperwork to fill half the room. Yet somehow it felt like a courtroom. David gestured toward the chair beside him. "Let's go through everything carefully." For the next 40 minutes, we reviewed document after document. Loan disclosures, closing statements, mortgage paperwork, wire instructions, insurance forms. Everything listed both James and me as the borrowers responsible for the loan. We were equally responsible for paying the mortgage, equally responsible for the debt. But when Denise placed the draft deed in front of me again, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Borrowers James and Ayla, owners James and Martha. David tapped the page gently. "This is where the problem begins." I looked at him. "How does something like this even happen?" He chose his words carefully. "The title company prepares documents based on instructions they receive during the transaction. So someone specifically instructed them to prepare the deed this way?" Denise answered quietly, "Yes." The room became completely silent. I already knew the answer, but hearing it spoken aloud felt different, more final, more real. I swallowed hard. "Who gave those instructions?" Denise glanced toward David before responding. "The instructions came from your husband." There it was. No misunderstanding, no clerical error, no typo. James had asked for this. I stared down at the document again, suddenly remembering every conversation where he'd told me not to worry about the paperwork. Every time he'd smiled and said, "I'll handle it." He had handled it, just not for us, for himself. David slid another document across the table. "This email chain confirms that the title instructions were changed several weeks ago." Several weeks. That meant this wasn't some last-minute decision. He'd planned it. He'd thought about it. He'd communicated with the title company behind my back. And then he'd continued looking me in the eyes every single day. I felt my chest tighten. "I have a question." David nodded. "Go ahead." If I had never opened that email, he didn't let me finish. The closing likely would have proceeded unless someone noticed the discrepancy. And after signing, the deed would have been recorded exactly as written. I looked at him carefully. "So, legally, you would have contributed your funds toward purchasing a property in which you were not listed as an owner." The words landed like a hammer. For a moment, nobody spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "What rights would I have had?" David leaned back slightly. potentially some equitable claims depending on the circumstances and state law, but proving those rights could require lengthy litigation. Being on the deed from the beginning is far stronger than trying to establish ownership afterward. In other words, a lawsuit, years of legal fees, stress, uncertainty, all because the man I married had decided not to include me. I closed the folder slowly. No. David looked at me. No. I'm not spending years fighting for something that's already mine. He gave a small nod. I was hoping you'd say that. Denise checked the time. It's almost 2:30. James would be arriving in about 30 minutes. Suddenly, everything became very real. David leaned forward. We need to decide how today's meeting will proceed. I don't want him warned. Won't be. I don't want anyone explaining this before he walks in. They won't. I want to hear his explanation before anyone says a word. David nodded again. That's reasonable. He paused. But I also want you prepared. For what? If he realizes the closing is in jeopardy, he may minimize what happened. Meaning, may say it was only temporary, or that it was an oversight. Exactly. I almost laugh. It's amazing how many excuses people suddenly discover after they're caught. David smiled faintly. That's human nature. I looked at the stack of documents one last time. So what happens if he refuses to change it? David didn't hesitate. The closing stops. And the house? The sellers would likely move on if the issue isn't resolved. What about our earnest money? There could be significant financial consequences depending on the purchase agreement. Thousands of dollars, possibly gone. I nodded slowly. And my money. If necessary, we pursue recovery through the appropriate legal process. I took a deep breath. I hope it doesn't come to that. So do I. At exactly 2:57 p.m., Denise's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. His here. Every muscle in my body tensed. This was it. 3 years of saving, 5 years of marriage. Every promise we'd made. Everything had led to this moment. David quietly arranged the documents in front of us. The draft deed sat on top, right where James wouldn't be able to miss it. A few seconds later, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Steady, confident, completely unaware. The conference room door opened. James walked in wearing the same relaxed smile he'd worn that morning. "Hey," he said cheerfully before looking around the room. Then he noticed me. His smile faded slightly. "I didn't know you were coming early." "I did." He frowned. "What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, his eyes landed on the documents spread across the table. Then he saw the deed. Color drained from his face so quickly it was almost startling. For the first time since I'd known him, James looked genuinely afraid. He looked at me, then at David, then back at the paperwork. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched for several long seconds. Finally, I folded my hands on the table, looked directly into my husband's eyes, and spoke as calmly as I had ever spoken in my life. "I'm here," I said, "because I wanted to find out where my money was actually going." The moment those words left my mouth, the room became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner above us. James didn't answer. He simply stood there, one hand still gripping the conference room door, staring at me as though he couldn't believe I was sitting in front of him. Then his eyes shifted to David. "What is this?" David remained perfectly calm. "We're reviewing the closing documents before they're signed." James forced an awkward laugh. "Okay, that's fine. We were already doing that tomorrow." I shook my head. "No, we were supposed to sign tomorrow." I gently slid the draft deed toward him. "I'm reviewing why I disappeared from the ownership today." His eyes dropped to the paper. For a split second, I saw something flash across his face. Not confusion. Recognition. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He slowly lowered himself into the chair across from me. "Ayla." His voice was barely above a whisper. I can explain? I looked straight at him. I've been waiting to hear that explanation. He rubbed both hands across his face before letting out a long breath. It's not what it looks like. I almost smiled. If I had $1 for every time someone used that sentence after getting caught, I could probably buy another house. Then tell me what it looks like. James glanced at Denise and David before looking back at me. I don't think this conversation should happen in front of everyone. David answered before I could. Considering this concerns the legal ownership of the property, I believe it's entirely appropriate. James's shoulders slumped. He realized he wasn't going to control the room. After another long silence, he finally spoke. My mom has been worried. I blinked. Worried? She's getting older? I waited. And she doesn't have much financial security. I stared at him. What does that have to do with our house? He leaned forward. It was just a strategy. A strategy? Yes. What kind of strategy puts your mother on the deed to a house your wife helped pay for? He hesitated. My mom thought. No. I interrupted him before he could finish. I'm asking what you thought. His jaw tightened. I thought it would protect everyone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Protect who? You. I actually laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes when something is so unbelievable your brain doesn't know how else to respond. Protect me? Yes. Please explain how removing my name from my own house protects me. He shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't permanent. I raised an eyebrow. It wasn't. No. When exactly were you planning to tell me? He didn't answer. After closing. Silence. A month later. Nothing. A year. Still nothing. The room seemed to shrink around us. David quietly slid another document toward James. This is the title instruction request submitted approximately 3 weeks ago. James looked at it but didn't touch it. His signature appeared at the bottom, his own handwriting, his own request. No misunderstanding, no accident. I looked back at him. You planned this? You planned this. I didn't think you'd understand. I stared at him in disbelief. So instead of talking to your wife, you decided to hide it from her. I wasn't hiding it. I leaned back in my chair. You weren't? No. I found out by accident. He opened his mouth, closed it again. There was no response to that because there wasn't one. David spoke calmly. Mr. Kane, can you explain why Mrs. Kane's name was removed from title despite her contributing substantially to the purchase? James looked frustrated. I never said she wouldn't own the house. I frowned. The deed says otherwise. It was just paperwork. David shook his head. No. His voice remained polite but firm. The deed is not just paperwork. It establishes legal ownership. James looked away. For the first time, I noticed sweat forming along his forehead. He knew this wasn't going the way he'd expected. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Mom. He immediately silenced the call. A few seconds later, it rang again. He rejected it. Again. 30 seconds later, another call. The room remained silent except for the vibration of his phone against the polished table. I looked at the screen. Martha, calling again. And again. She already knew something was wrong. Eventually, James turned the phone face down. I'll call her later. No, I said quietly. I think this conversation has involved your mother from the beginning. He looked up. It doesn't concern her. I couldn't stop myself. Really? Yes. Then why is she on the deed? That question hung in the air. James had no answer. Finally, he sighed. My mom has always worried that if marriages fail, assets disappear. I folded my arms. So your solution was to make sure your wife had no ownership. That's not what I was doing. Then what were you doing? He hesitated before speaking again. My mom thought if the house stayed in the family. I cut him off immediately. I am your family. The words echoed through the conference room. I have been your family for 5 years. No one spoke. I continued. I skipped vacations for this house. I know. I worked overtime for this house. I know. I emptied my savings account for this house. I know. My name belongs on that deed. He quietly looked down at the table. I know. I felt something inside me crack. Not because he'd admitted it, because he'd admitted it so easily. There wasn't even an argument anymore, just acceptance. As though he already knew he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. David gently broke the silence. Mr. Kane, under the circumstances, the transaction cannot proceed unless all ownership issues are resolved. James nodded slowly. I understand. No, I said. I don't think you do. He looked back at me. I trusted you. I know. I never once asked to see the paperwork because I believed you were protecting our future. Was trying to. No. My voice stayed calm. You were protecting someone else's future. His phone vibrated again. This time, a voicemail notification appeared almost immediately after the missed call. Then another text message. Then another. Martha clearly wasn't giving up. James never even looked at them, because for the first time since walking into the room, he understood exactly where the real problem was. It wasn't his mother's anger. It was the woman sitting across the table, the woman who now knew everything, and the woman who still hadn't told him what would happen next. He swallowed hard. Ayla, what? What do you want me to do? I looked down at the deed one last time, then back into his eyes. I haven't decided yet. The truth was, I already had. I just wanted to hear whether he was willing to choose honesty before I forced him to. Because the next words out of my mouth weren't going to be emotional. They weren't going to be angry. They were going to determine whether we walked out of that building as partners or as two people preparing for a legal battle that neither of us would ever forget. For a few long seconds, no one in the room spoke. James kept looking at me as though he was waiting for me to calm down, to cry, or to tell him we could figure everything out later at home. But that woman wasn't sitting across from him anymore. The woman who had blindly trusted every reassurance, every smile, every "don't worry, I've got it," had disappeared the moment I opened that email. What sat across from him now was someone who had spent the last 18 hours reading documents, organizing financial records, speaking with attorneys, and preparing for exactly this conversation. I folded my hands on the table. I'm going to make this very simple. James nodded nervously. Okay. You have 2 choices. His eyes never left mine. The first choice is that the title documents are rewritten immediately. He listened without interrupting. My name goes on that deed exactly where it should have been from the beginning. James Kane and Ayla Kane. No substitutions. No additional owners. No side agreements. No promises that we'll fix it later. It gets corrected before anyone signs a single page. He swallowed hard. And the second choice, the closing stops. His face tightened. I'll notify the lender that there's an ownership dispute. David remained silent, allowing me to continue. I'll instruct the title company that I will not authorize the transaction. James opened his mouth, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. He slowly closed it again. If necessary, I'll immediately begin the legal process to recover every dollar I contributed toward that down payment. His breathing became noticeably heavier, and after that, I paused just long enough for every word to sink in. I'll file for legal separation. The room went completely still. Even Denise stopped taking notes. James stared at me in disbelief. You'd really do that? I looked at him without blinking. You already believed I'd sign away my financial future without reading the paperwork. He didn't answer. So yes, I continued, I've learned not to make that mistake twice. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This doesn't have to become a divorce conversation. I didn't make it one. Ayla, you did. His shoulders dropped. I never wanted to hurt you. I took a slow breath. I believe that. His eyes lifted with a tiny hint of hope. But wanting and doing aren't the same thing. That hope disappeared almost instantly. You didn't accidentally type your mother's name. Silence. You didn't accidentally send instructions to the title company. Silence. You didn't accidentally keep it from for weeks. Silence again. Those were choices. Every sentence landed heavier than the one before it. I trusted your judgment because I thought we were building a life together. I shook my head slowly. You were building a legal safety net for someone else? James looked exhausted. My mom kept telling me. I don't care. The words came out firmly, but not loudly. She can give you advice? I leaned slightly forward. She cannot make decisions about money that belongs to both of us. He looked down at the table. I know. No. I gently pushed the deed toward him again. You know now because you got caught. Another painful silence settled over the room. His phone buzzed once more. This time he picked it up, looked at the screen, and immediately muted it without reading the message. David finally spoke. Mr. Kane, from a legal standpoint, Mrs. Kane is correct. James looked over. If the ownership issue isn't resolved today, tomorrow's closing cannot proceed. I understand. There are also financial consequences. I know. The earnest munsit may be forfeited depending on the seller's response. James closed his eyes. We had worked so hard to save that money. Months of sacrifice, years of discipline. If the transaction collapsed, a significant portion of it could disappear. I knew he was doing the math in his head. The deposit, the inspection costs, the appraisal, the loan fees, the moving expenses we'd already paid. Everything. But I also knew something else. He couldn't simply hand me my share of the down payment. Most of our available cash was already committed to this purchase. If I pulled out now, he didn't have enough money sitting in another account to buy me out. For the first time since we'd entered this room, James realized he wasn't negotiating from a position of strength. He had no leverage. He looked at me quietly. If we change the deed. I waited. Can we just move forward? I stared at him. You think this is about paperwork? It isn't? No. I felt my voice soften. This is about trust. He looked genuinely heartbroken. I made a mistake. I shook my head. A mistake is forgetting to sign a form. He lowered his eyes. This was a plan. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. Several long moments passed before he spoke again. I don't want to lose you. Those words would have meant everything to me 24 hours earlier. Now, they weren't enough. I answered honestly. You should have thought about that before you decided I didn't need to know who owned our home. He looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he simply nodded, because there wasn't an argument left to make. Finally, he turned toward Denise. If we change the title today, she answered immediately. We'll need revised ownership instructions. Can that be done? Today? If everyone cooperates? He looked back at me. I'll sign whatever needs to be signed. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to be absolutely certain. No conditions? No. No conversations with your mother first. He hesitated for the briefest moment. Then he slowly shook his head. Knuckle? No delaying until tomorrow? No. No asking me to trust you again. His eyes filled with regret. For the first time that afternoon, I believed he understood the situation. Not because he finally agreed with me. Because he had finally realized he didn't have another option. David looked toward Denise. Please begin preparing corrected title documents reflecting James Kane and Ayla Kane as the sole joint owners. Denise nodded, gathered the paperwork, and quietly left the conference room. The door closed behind her. For several minutes, Neither James nor I spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Finally, James looked across the table. I really thought I was helping. I studied his face. Maybe he believed that. Maybe he'd convinced himself that protecting his mother's future somehow didn't threaten mine. Maybe years of listening to her fears had clouded his judgment. But none of those possibilities changed what he'd actually done. Intent didn't erase consequences. I stood slowly and walked toward the large window overlooking the parking lot. People were coming and going, completely unaware that inside this building, one marriage was balancing on the edge of a signature. Without turning around, I spoke quietly. "You know what hurts the most," he answered softly. "What?" "It isn't that you chose your mother." I paused. "It's that you thought I would never notice." Behind me, I heard him inhale sharply, but he said nothing, because deep down, he knew that was the part neither of us would ever be able to forget. The next hour felt longer than the previous 5 years of my marriage. No one left the conference room. David reviewed a few remaining documents while James sat quietly across from me, his phone resting face down on the table. Every few minutes it vibrated again. Buzz. A few moments later, buzz. Then again. Neither of us needed to guess who it was. Eventually James picked it up, glanced at the screen, and let out a slow breath. "It's my mom?" I didn't answer. He looked at me almost as if he were asking permission. "I'm going to have to tell her." "That's your decision." He hesitated. "Would you mind if I stepped outside for a minute?" I looked at David. He simply shrugged. "This is your meeting." I turned back to James. "Go ahead." James stood, walked into the hallway, and quietly closed the conference room door behind him. The room fell silent again. Denise hadn't returned yet. Only David and I remained. He waited until James was out of earshot before speaking. "How are you holding up?" I laughed softly. "I honestly don't know." "You've handled this remarkably well." I looked down at my wedding ring. Don't know." "Disappointed?" David nodded. "Sometimes disappointment lasts longer than anger." His words stayed with me, because he was right. Anger burns hot. Disappointment settles deep. About 10 minutes later, muffled voices drifted through the hallway. James wasn't yelling, but whoever was on the other end clearly was. Even through the closed door, I could hear a woman's raised voice. Not the words, just the anger. Another few minutes passed before James came back inside. He looked completely drained. His shoulders were slumped. His tie was slightly crooked. His face had lost what little color it still had. I didn't ask how the conversation went. I didn't need to. He sat down quietly. "My mom isn't happy," I answered calmly. "I didn't expect her to be." He nodded. "She thinks I'm making a mistake." I looked directly at him. "And what do you think?" He was quiet for several seconds. "I think I already made one." For the first time all afternoon, I believed he was telling the truth. Not because he wanted to save the deal, because the reality of what he'd almost destroyed was finally catching up to him. A knock sounded at the door. Denise returned carrying a fresh stack of papers. She placed them neatly in front of David. "The revised deed has been prepared." No one spoke. She slid the first page toward me. I took a deep breath before looking down. There it was, buyer, James Kane and Ayla Kane, as joint tenants. I read the line 3 times, not because I doubted it, because I needed to see it with my own eyes. After everything that had happened, I wasn't taking anyone's word for anything ever again. David smiled slightly. "Please review every page." I did exactly that, slowly. Carefree name, every address, every legal description, every signature line. If there was one lesson I'd learned, it was that excitement should never replace attention. James reviewed his copy just as carefully. When we both finished, David looked at us. "Are there any remaining concerns regarding ownership?" I answered first. No. James quietly shook his head. No. Denise placed signature tabs throughout the documents. One by one, we signed where indicated. Every signature felt strangely symbolic. Some represented the purchase of our home. Others represented the end of blind trust. When I signed the deed, I paused for just a moment before putting the pen down. 3 years of sacrifice, thousands of dollars, countless skipped vacations, late nights at work, meals cooked at home. Every sacrifice now had legal protection. The house finally belonged to the 2 people who had actually paid for it. After the final signatures were complete, Denise gathered the paperwork. I'll have these recorded after closing tomorrow. I nodded. Thank you. She smiled politely. I'm glad we were able to resolve everything before funding. After she left, David organized his files before standing. My work here is finished. He looked at me first. If you ever have questions about your ownership rights, don't hesitate to call. I appreciate everything you've done. Then he turned toward James. I hope today's lesson stays with both of you. James simply nodded. So do I. A few minutes later, David left us alone. For the first time all day, it was just the 2 of us. Neither of us seemed eager to speak. Finally, James broke the silence. I looked at him honestly. I don't either. I love you. The words hung between us. I believed he meant them. That was the hardest part. Love wasn't the question anymore. Trust was. I love you too, I admitted quietly. His eyes lifted. But love isn't what almost disappeared from that deed. He closed his eyes. You didn't forget my name. Duh. I know. You replaced it. His shoulders dropped again. No. I need you to understand something. I'm listening. If I hadn't opened that email, I paused. I would have walked into tomorrow believing I was becoming a homeowner. He looked away. When in reality, I would have been helping buy a house that legally belonged to you and your mother. He couldn't deny it, because it was true. We walked out of the title company together just before 5 o'clock. The summer air felt unusually warm. People were laughing in the parking lot. Someone nearby was loading groceries into their car. Life carried on exactly as it always had, yet everything felt different. James reached for my hand as we walked. Without thinking, I slipped it into my pocket instead. It wasn't meant to punish him. I just wasn't ready. He noticed, but he didn't say anything. The drive home was almost completely silent. Normally we'd be talking about paint colors, moving boxes, furniture, and everything we planned to do once we got the keys. Instead, the only sound was the steady hum of the tires against the road. Halfway home, James finally spoke. I'll tell my mom she's no longer involved. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. That's between you and her. She's going to blame you? I shrugged gently. She already does. He looked out the passenger window. I should have handled this differently. Yes. I should have talked to you? Yes. I should have remembered that you're my wife. For the first time since the meeting began, I felt tears threatening to form, not because he finally understood, because I wished he'd understood before we ever reached that conference room. That evening we unlocked the door to our apartment, and for the first time in 5 years, it didn't feel like home. Not because we were moving, because something invisible had been left behind in that title company's conference room. We had saved the house. We had protected our investment. But neither of us could honestly say we'd walked away without losing something far more difficult to replace. The next afternoon, we returned to the title company for the official closing. If someone had walked into that conference room without knowing everything that had happened the day before, they probably would have thought they were looking at any other couple buying their first home. The lender's representative smiled as documents were passed around the table. The escrow officer explained the final steps. Everyone congratulated us on reaching such an important milestone. Only James and I knew that the real closing had happened the day before. Today's signatures were simply completing a transaction. Yesterday's confrontation had decided whether that transaction would ever exist. This time, before I signed a single page, I read every document from beginning to end. Not because I expected another surprise, because I had learned that protecting your future isn't about expecting the worst. It's about making sure you understand exactly what you're agreeing to. When the final document was signed, Denise smiled warmly. Congratulations! You're officially homeowners. For years, I had imagined that sentence would be one of the happiest moments of my life. Instead, I felt something much more complicated: relief, pride, sadness, gratitude, disappointment, all at the same time. We picked up the keys, thanked everyone, and walked outside together. James looked at the small ring of keys in his hand before placing them gently into mine. I think these belong with you. I looked down at them for a moment. 3 years of sacrifice, thousands of dollars, hundreds of conversations about our future. Everything had finally led here. Only now I understood that owning a house and feeling secure inside a marriage weren't always the same thing. Moving day came a week later. Friends helped us carry boxes. My sister brought pizza for everyone. Neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves. From the outside, everything looked exactly as I'd imagined all those years while scrolling through pictures of dream homes online. The porch looked just as beautiful. The kitchen filled with sunlight every morning. The backyard was even bigger than I remembered. Every room held possibilities. Yet every time I walked through the front door, I also remembered the document that had almost changed everything. James tried. I want to be fair about that. He really did. He apologized more than once. Not the quick, casual kind of apology people give just to end an argument. Real apologies. He admitted he'd allowed his mother's fears to influence his judgment. He admitted he should have trusted me enough to have an honest conversation instead of making a decision behind my back. He admitted he had betrayed my confidence, and every single time I believed he was sincere. The problem wasn't whether I believed his apology. The problem was learning how to believe his decisions again. Trust doesn't disappear all at once. It cracks, one small fracture at a time. Sometimes you don't even notice those cracks until enough pressure is placed on them. Then, suddenly, the whole foundation shifts beneath your feet. A few weeks after we moved in, James brought up something I'd secretly been thinking about myself. I think we need help. I looked at him. What kind of help? Marriage counseling? For a long moment, neither of us spoke. A few months earlier, I probably would have taken that suggestion as an insult. Now, it sounded like responsibility. So I agreed. Counseling wasn't easy. Some sessions left us emotionally exhausted. Others forced us to have conversations we'd been avoiding for years. We talked about boundaries, communication, money, family expectations, and perhaps most importantly, loyalty. One question our counselor asked has stayed with me ever since. When two people get married, she said, who becomes your immediate family? James answered almost instantly, my wife. There wasn't even a pause, no hesitation, just those two words, my wife. I looked at him, wondering why that answer had come so easily now when it had been so difficult months earlier. Maybe sometimes people don't fully understand the promises they've made until those promises are tested. Healing wasn't immediate. Some days were good, others weren't. There were moments when I caught myself second-guessing simple things. If James told me he'd handled a bill, I'd quietly log in later just to verify it. If paperwork arrived in the mail, I read every page before filing it away. Not because I wanted to, because trust, once broken, asks for proof where faith used to be enough. James never complained. In fact, whenever I double-checked something, he'd simply nod. I understand. Those 2 words meant more than any grand apology ever could, because he recognized that rebuilding trust wasn't something he could ask for. It was something he had to earn. Months turned into a year. Slowly, life became more normal. We celebrated our first Christmas in the new house, hosted Thanksgiving for both sides of the family, planted flowers along the front walkway that spring. We laughed again, made new memories, built routines. Little by little, the house began to feel less like the place where our marriage almost fell apart and more like the place where we decided to fight for it. That doesn't mean everything returned to the way it was before. It didn't. Some things, once broken, never fit together exactly the same again, and maybe that's okay, because pretending nothing happened would have been another kind of lie. Instead, we chose to build something stronger on top of the truth. People sometimes ask me whether I regret staying. The answer isn't simple. Every relationship is different. Every betrayal is different. Every person has to decide what they can forgive and what they cannot. For me, staying only became possible because James accepted complete responsibility. He stopped making excuses. He stopped blaming his mother. He stopped asking me to just move on. Instead, he chose accountability every single day. That made all the difference. But if he had continued defending what he'd done, if he'd insisted I was overreacting, if he'd refused to change those documents, I would have walked away without looking back, because no house is worth sacrificing your self-respect. Looking back now, I realize the biggest lesson wasn't about real estate. It wasn't even about marriage. It was about paying attention. We spend so much time trusting the people we love that sometimes we forget to protect ourselves too. Love and trust should go hand in hand. Neither one should require blindness. So if there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this. Whether you're buying a house, starting a business, signing a loan, or making any major financial decision with someone else, never assume everything is exactly as you imagined. Read the documents. Ask the questions. Understand what you're signing. Not because you expect betrayal, but because protecting your future is an act of wisdom, not suspicion. I still love our home. Every morning when I open the curtains and sunlight pours into the living room, I'm grateful we fought for it, not just because it's a beautiful house, because it's legally ours. And every now and then, when I open the fireproof box where we keep our important documents, I still glance at the deed. Right there, side by side, are the names that should have been there from the very beginning. James Kane and Ayla Kane. Those names remind me that I protected more than an investment. I protected my future. And if my story helps even one person slow down, read the fine print, and avoid making the mistake I almost made, then everything I went through will have served a purpose. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever experienced a betrayal that changed the way you looked at someone you loved, or if you've learned an important life lesson the hard way, I hope you'll share it in the comments. Sometimes the stories we tell each other become the warnings someone else desperately needed to hear. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. You never know which story might remind you that protecting your peace, your future, and your self-worth is always worth the effort.